Have you ever wondered what happens to love when people stop believing in God? What becomes of the human heart when it rejects the very source of love itself? Can love even exist without its creator? In 1868, in the city of Turin, Italy, a priest witnessed something that would change how we understand love, sin, and the human soul. His name was Giovanni Melchiorre Bosco, known to the world as Don Bosco, and what he saw on the night of April 10th was not a dream. It was a vision so powerful, so real, that when he touched the wall of hell during this experience, his hand burned and the skin peeled off his palm for days afterward. The physical wound proved what many already knew. This was no ordinary dream. But before we talk about what he saw, you need to understand who these people were and why God showed him this vision in the first place. Turin, in 1868, was a city in chaos. The Industrial Revolution had ripped through Italy like a wildfire, pulling families from their farms and cramming them into slums. 117,000 people packed into a city that was bursting at the seams. Boys as young as 12 worked in factories for 16 hours a day. Orphans slept under bridges. Children sold themselves for bread. The streets near Porta Palazzo swarmed with peddlers, shoe polishers, stable boys, vendors of every kind, all scrambling to survive one more day. Don Bosco walked those streets every single day. He was 43 years old in 1868, but he looked older. His face was gaunt, his body was thin. He spent every waking hour with boys that nobody else wanted, street kids, criminals, thieves. Boys who had been thrown into prison cells with adult murderers and rapists, boys who learned to hate before they learned to read. He founded the Oratory of St. Francis de Sales in 1846 in a rented shed in Valdocco, a rough neighborhood where a saloon stood on one side and a brothel on the other. He did not care. He took in boys one by one, teaching them trades, feeding them when he had no food himself, clothing them when he owned nothing but his cassock. His mother, Margaret, a 59-year-old peasant woman, left her home to help him. She became mother to hundreds of boys who had never known what a mother was. By 1868, Don Bosco was exhausted. He heard confessions for 8 hours a day. He taught, he built. He wrote books and pamphlets defending the faith against the wave of secularism that was sweeping through Italy. Anti-clerical politicians wanted him dead. They saw his boys as a revolutionary army. The Marquis de Cavour, chief of police in Turin, interrogated him multiple times. Assassination attempts came one after another. A gunshot through a church window in 1848 that missed his head by inches. Poisoning attempts, a near stabbing, a near bludgeoning. He kept going. If you value documented Catholic history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from the biographical memoirs of St. John Bosco, specifically Volume 9, pages 166 through 181, which contains the first-hand account of this vision as narrated by Don Bosco himself on Sunday night, May 3rd, 1868, to the boys of his oratory. These are not legend or folklore. These are documented testimonies recorded by people who were there in the room when he spoke. Now back to the information. Don Bosco had been having nightmares for a week. They started on April 17th, 1868. Every night he would fall asleep and immediately be tormented by visions that left him more exhausted in the morning than if he had worked through the night. He told his boys later that these dreams so drained him that he could barely function during the day. On the night of April 10th, he tried to stay awake. He was terrified of what might come. He set his pillow upright against the headboard and sat up in bed, forcing himself to stay conscious. But exhaustion took him. The moment his eyes closed, a figure appeared beside his bed. Don Bosco called him the man with the cap. Some say it was an angel. Some say it was St. Francis de Sales. Some say it was a deceased student. Don Bosco never identified him. The figure said, "Get up and follow me." Don Bosco did not want to go. He begged. He said he had a toothache. He said he needed rest. The figure did not care. He grabbed Don Bosco by the hand and pulled him out of bed. Suddenly they were standing on a wide road lined with roses and beautiful flowers. The road was comfortable. The hedges were magnificent, covered in blooms that smelled sweet and looked inviting. Don Bosco looked ahead and saw his boys from the oratory walking down this road. Hundreds of them, all recognizable, all known to him by name. Then he noticed something. As the boys walked, some of them stumbled. They fell, and the moment they hit the ground, they were yanked backward by an invisible force, sliding down the path toward a distant cliff. Don Bosco ran to help them. He reached out his hands, but the guide stopped him. "Take a closer look," the figure said. Don Bosco knelt and examined the ground. Everywhere hidden in the grass and flowers were traps, lassos, snares. Each one had a name carved into it. Pride, disobedience, envy, impurity, theft, gluttony, anger, laziness. And the worst one, the trap that caught almost everyone, was labeled human respect. The guide explained. Human respect is the fear of what others think of you, the desire to be liked more than the desire to be good. It is when you choose the approval of your peers over the approval of God. Don Bosco watched as boy after boy got caught. They would trip, fall, and then slide helplessly down the slope. He saw them trying to grab onto the flowers, trying to stop themselves, but the force pulling them was too strong. They screamed. They clawed at the ground, but they kept sliding. And at the bottom of that slope was a bronze door, massive and terrifying, standing at the edge of a ravine. Then Don Bosco saw one of his boys racing toward that door at an uncontrollable speed. The boy's hair was wild, standing up on his head, blown back by the wind. His arms flailed like he was drowning in invisible water. He wanted to stop, but could not. His face was filled with terror. Don Bosco recognized him. He knew his name. He knew his family. He shouted, "Let us help him! Let us stop him!" The guide grabbed Don Bosco's arm and held him back. Do you not know how terrible God's vengeance is? Do you think you can restrain one who is fleeing from his just wrath? The boy slammed into the bronze door. It exploded open with a roar so loud it shook the ground. Behind that door were 1,000 more doors, all bronze, all massive, stretching back into darkness. And as the first door opened, all the others opened with it, one after another, a deafening chain reaction of metal crashing against metal. At the far end of that corridor, Don Bosco saw furnace jaws spouting fiery globes. The boy was sucked inside. The doors slammed shut. Silence. Don Bosco stood there in shock. Then he saw 3 more boys tumbling down the slope. Then 5 more. Then 10. They came in waves, rolling like stones, screaming, crashing into that door, disappearing into the fire. He recognized every single one of them. These were his boys. Boys he had taught, boys he had fed, boys he had loved. The guide pulled Don Bosco closer to the edge of the ravine. From there, Don Bosco could see into the abyss. It was a cave sunk deep into the earth, and the entire cave glowed white hot. The walls were molten. The ceiling dripped fire. The floor was a lake of burning metal. And standing in that inferno were boys, hundreds of them, perfectly still, glowing like statues made of fire. They did not move. They did not speak. They just burned. Don Bosco turned to the guide in horror. How can these boys be damned? Last night, they were still alive at the oratory. The guide answered calmly. The boys you see here are all dead to God's grace. Were they to die now or persist in their evil ways, they would indeed be damned. Don Bosco felt his heart collapse. He asked, when these boys come dashing into this cave, do they not know where they are going? They surely do. They have been warned 1,000 times, but they still choose to rush into the fire because they do not detest sin and are loath to forsake it. Furthermore, they despise and reject God's incessant merciful invitations to do penance. Thus provoked, divine justice harries them, hounds them, and goads them on, so that they cannot halt until they reach this place. Don Bosco could not believe what he was hearing. He asked, how can anyone choose this? The guide answered, because they loved something more than they loved God. And when you love something more than God, you become enslaved to it. And when you die enslaved to it, you carry that slavery into eternity. The guide then took Don Bosco by the hand and led him into the cave. The moment he stepped inside, he found himself in a magnificent hall. The heat was unbearable. The walls were transparent, like crystal, and through them he could see layers upon layers of souls suffering in different chambers. Above each doorway was an inscription. One door read, "The Sixth Commandment." The guide pointed to it and said, "Transgressions of this commandment cause the eternal ruin of many boys." Don Bosco asked, did they not go to confession? They did, but they either made a bad confession or purposely omitted their sins. Some said they committed such sins 2 or 3 times when it was 4 or 5. Others who had fallen into sin in their childhood were ashamed and never confessed it. Others did not have true sorrow or lacked the resolve to avoid it in the future. There were even some who, rather than examine their consciences, spent their time trying to figure out how to deceive their confessor. Anyone dying in this frame of mind chooses to be among the damned. Don Bosco saw boys he knew behind that curtain, boys whose conduct seemed good on the surface, boys who smiled in church, boys who served at Mass, but their souls were dead. They had chosen pleasure over purity, and that choice had cost them everything. The guide lifted another curtain. Above this one was written, Radix Omnium Malorum, the root of all evils. Don Bosco asked, what is the sin designated by this phrase? The guide answered, disobedience. Disobedience is the root of all evil. It was disobedience that led Adam and Eve to commit the first sin and be driven from their earthly paradise. It is disobedience that leads every soul to hell. Behind that curtain, Don Bosco saw more boys from the oratory. The guide explained their sins. Some were there for stealing small amounts of money, some for breaking into the pantry or the treasurer's office, some for stealing clothes and blankets from the wardrobe to send home to their families, some for willful damage they never repaired, some for not returning borrowed items, some for greed, for letting their love of material possessions grow so strong that their love of God withered and died. The guide said, some boys are so attached to material possessions that their love of God is lessened. Thus, they sin against charity, piety, and meekness. Even the mere desire of riches can corrupt the heart. especially if such a desire leads to injustice. Then the guide lifted a third curtain, and behind it, Don Bosco saw more oratory boys covered in worms and disgusting insects that gnawed at their hearts, their eyes, their hands, their legs, their entire bodies. They stood motionless, frozen in torment. Don Bosco tried to call out to them, but they did not respond. They did not even look at him. He asked the guide why they could not see him or hear him. The guide explained, "The damned are totally deprived of freedom. Each must endure the full weight of God's punishment with no change whatsoever in his state." Don Bosco looked closer and saw something that filled him with even greater horror. The ceiling above the damned became transparent as crystal, and through it he could see heaven. He could see the souls of the saved, radiant, joyful, free, safe for all eternity. The damned could see them too, and the sight filled them with uncontrollable rage. They fumed with envy. They burned with hatred. They gnashed their teeth and clawed at themselves in fury because they had once mocked those very people when they were alive. They had ridiculed the good, they had laughed at purity, they had scorned devotion, and now they were trapped in the consequences of their own choices, while those they had mocked were forever happy. Don Bosco pressed his ear to the crystal ceiling and heard screams and sobs, blasphemies and curses against the saints. The sound was unbearable. The guide then led him deeper into the cavern, down a corridor to a lower level. Above the entrance was written in Latin, "Their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched." Don Bosco did not want to go any further. He begged the guide to let him leave. But the guide said, "You must see this. You must understand the full reality of what awaits those who reject God's love." As they walked, the guide explained something that Don Bosco would never forget. He said, "These souls did not stop loving. They still love, but their love has been twisted. It has been corrupted. It has been turned inward and has become a prison. They love themselves. They love their sins. They love their pride and their pleasure and their anger and their lust. And because they chose to love those things more than they loved God, those things have become their eternity. Love without God is not love at all. It is obsession. It is slavery. It is a fire that consumes but never satisfies. These souls burn because their desires burn, and there is no grace to temper them, no mercy to cool them, no God to free them. They have what they wanted. They wanted to be their own gods. They wanted to live for themselves. They wanted pleasure without consequence, freedom without responsibility, love without sacrifice. And now they have it, forever. If you value deeply researched content like this, leave a comment from which city you're listening. Now back to the vision. Don Bosco asked the guide a question that haunted him. He said, "What should I tell my boys about all of this? How can I warn them without terrifying them? How can I help them avoid this fate?" The guide answered, "Tell them to avoid idleness. Tell them to keep themselves busy at all times so that the devil does not have time to tempt them. Idleness was the origin of the sin of Holy King David. Tell them that obedience to God, the church, their parents, and their superiors, even in small things, will save them. Tell them to make frequent and sincere confessions. Tell them to receive Holy Communion devoutly. Tell them to have devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Tell them that these are the weapons that will cut the snares of the devil." The guide then showed Don Bosco something that gave him a small measure of hope. He showed him the tools that were scattered on the ground near the traps. Next to each snare, there were knives and swords and hammers. Each one had a name. One was labeled Frequent Communion. Another was labeled Confession. Another was labeled Devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. Another was labeled Devotion to the Blessed Virgin. Another was labeled Devotion to St. Joseph and the Saints. The guide explained, "God has provided a way to cut the snares, but the boys must use these tools. They must choose to pick them up. They must choose to fight. If they do, they will be saved. If they do not, they will be dragged down." Don Bosco asked one final question. He said, "May I take down the names of the boys I saw so that I may warn them individually?" The guide shook his head. "There is no need for that. Always preach against immodesty. Always preach against disobedience. Always preach against pride. A generic warning will suffice. Bear in mind that even if you admonished them individually, they would make you 1,000 promises, but not always sincerely. For firm resolution not to sin again, one needs God's grace, which will never be denied to your boys if they ask. God is so good that he manifests his power, especially by being merciful and forgiving. On your part, pray and make sacrifices. As for the boys, let them listen to your admonitions and teachings and let them consult their consciences, which will tell them what to do." Then the guide did something that Don Bosco would remember for the rest of his life. He reached out and pressed Don Bosco's hand against the outer wall of the cave. The wall was not glowing, it was not visibly hot, but the moment Don Bosco's skin touched it, he screamed. The pain was beyond anything he had ever felt. It was not just physical pain, it was the pain of separation from God. It was the pain of a soul cut off from love, from light, from hope, from everything good and beautiful and true. Don Bosco yanked his hand back and collapsed. He woke up in his bed. His cassock was soaked with sweat. His body was trembling. and his hand was burned. The skin was red and blistered. Over the next few days, the skin peeled off his palm in sheets. He showed it to the boys at the oratory. He showed it to the other priests. He said, "This is not a dream. This is real. Hell is real. And it is waiting for anyone who chooses to reject God's love." On Sunday night, May 3rd, 1868, Don Bosco gathered all the boys of the oratory and told them what he had seen. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not soften it. He told them everything. The road lined with flowers, the hidden traps, the bronze door, the cave of fire, the boys burning in silence, the worms, the rage, the crystal ceiling showing heaven, the terrible truth that those souls had chosen this fate for themselves. The boys listened in silence. Some wept. Some trembled. Some left that room and went straight to confession. Some made resolutions to change their lives. Some did not. Don Bosco watched them closely in the weeks and months that followed. He saw which boys took the vision seriously and which boys dismissed it. He saw which boys picked up the weapons of grace and which boys walked straight into the traps. And he prayed for all of them, knowing that his time with them was short and their eternity was long. Don Bosco lived for 20 more years after that vision. He founded the Salesian Order in 1859, which was formally approved by the Vatican in 1869. By the time of his death on January 31st, 1888, he had established 250 houses across the world dedicated to educating and saving young people. Thousands of boys passed through his oratories. Thousands more were influenced by his writings. And every single one of them heard about the vision of hell at some point in their time with him. But the vision was not meant only for those boys. It was meant for us, for every generation that would come after, for every person who would ever be tempted to believe that love can exist without God, for every soul who would ever think they could find happiness by choosing pleasure over purity, self over sacrifice, pride over humility, disobedience over obedience. The world Don Bosco lived in was not so different from ours. The Industrial Revolution was ripping apart families just like modern technology tears us apart today. Boys were being exploited by factories, just like children are exploited by digital platforms now. Secularism was rising. Atheism was trendy. Politicians were hostile to the church. Anti-Catholic propaganda filled the newspapers. Attempts were made on the lives of faithful priests. It was a time of chaos and confusion, just like now. And in the middle of that chaos, God sent Don Bosco a vision to remind people of a simple truth. Love is not a feeling. It is not a preference. It is not a choice we make based on what feels good in the moment. Love is a person. Love is God. And when we reject God, we do not become free to love whatever we want. We become enslaved to whatever we want, and that slavery follows us into eternity. The boys Don Bosco saw in hell were not there because they committed one big sin. They were there because they chose 1,000 small sins and never repented. They chose comfort over duty. They chose pleasure over purity. They chose the approval of friends over the approval of God. They chose to hide their sins in confession instead of confessing them fully. They chose to make excuses instead of making changes. And those small choices, repeated over and over, hardened their hearts until they could no longer feel the love of God calling them back. That is what happens to love when God is ignored. It does not disappear. It turns into something else. It becomes lust. It becomes greed. It becomes pride. It becomes envy. It becomes a cruel master that demands more and more and gives less and less until there is nothing left but burning and emptiness and rage. The guide told Don Bosco something that he repeated to his boys over and over for the rest of his life. He said, "These souls loved, but they loved the wrong things. They loved themselves more than they loved God. They loved pleasure more than they loved purity. They loved comfort more than they loved truth. And because they chose to orient their love toward created things instead of the Creator, their love became a prison instead of a freedom. God is love. That is not a metaphor. It is not poetry. It is ontological reality. God is the source, the substance, and the summit of all love. Every act of true love participates in His nature. Every act of charity, every sacrifice, every moment of selflessness is a participation in the divine life. And when we reject God, we do not just lose religion or morality or some abstract concept of goodness. We lose the capacity to love truly. We lose the very thing that makes us human. The boys in Don Bosco's vision were still capable of desire. They still wanted things. They still craved and lusted and envied. But they could no longer love. Love requires freedom. Love requires grace. Love requires the presence of God. And in hell, God is absent by choice, not His choice, theirs. They chose to push Him away. They chose to live as if He did not exist. They chose to mock those who followed Him. And when they died, God honored their choice. He gave them what they wanted, a universe without Him. And that universe is hell. Don Bosco died on January 31st, 1888, at the age of 72. His funeral was attended by thousands. 40,000 people lined the streets of Turin to pay their respects. The Italian government, which had spent decades trying to shut him down, sent representatives to honor him. The boys he had saved, now grown men, wept openly. Priests and bishops traveled from across Europe to be there. It was one of the largest funerals in Italian history. But more important than the funeral were the lives he had changed. The boys he had pulled out of prisons, the orphans he had fed, the street kids he had clothed, the young men he had taught to read and write and work and pray. Thousands of them. And among those thousands, how many would have ended up in the hell he saw in his vision if he had not intervened? How many souls were saved because one priest was willing to look at the ugliest truth and refuse to turn away? In 1929, Pope Pius XI beatified Don Bosco. In 1934, on Easter Sunday, April 1st, the same pope canonized him and gave him the title Father and Teacher of Youth. In 1949, Pope Pius XII declared him the patron saint of Catholic publishers. Today, the Salesian Order operates in 134 countries. It runs schools, universities, vocational training centers, orphanages, parishes, missions, and youth centers on every continent. Millions of young people have passed through Salesian institutions, and all of it traces back to one priest in Turin who refused to let the children of the Industrial Revolution perish without a fight. But here is what most people do not know. In the years following the vision, Don Bosco had another dream. In this one, he saw the boys of the oratory again, but this time they were on a ship in the middle of a violent storm. The ship represented the church. The storm represented the attacks of the secular world, and the boys were fighting to keep the ship afloat while enemy vessels fired cannons at them from all sides. In the dream, Don Bosco saw two massive pillars rising out of the sea. One pillar had a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary on top, with the inscription, Mary Help of Christians. The other pillar had a large white host on top representing the Eucharist. The Pope was steering the ship, trying to reach those two pillars. Enemies shot at him. He was wounded. He fell. Another Pope took his place. He was also wounded. He also fell. Finally, a third Pope managed to anchor the ship between the two pillars, and the moment he did, the storm stopped. The enemies fled. The church was saved. Don Bosco told his boys that the two pillars represented the only two things that could save the church and save their souls: devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary and devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. Everything else was secondary. Everything else could fail. But those two pillars would never fall. He spent the last years of his life teaching his boys to pray the rosary every single day. He taught them to visit Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament as often as possible. He told them that the devil was terrified of these two things. He said, "Do you want the Lord to give you many graces? Visit him often. Do you want him to give you few graces? Visit him rarely. Do you want the devil to attack you? Visit Jesus rarely in the Blessed Sacrament. Do you want him to flee from you? Visit Jesus often." And he meant it. Don Bosco himself spent hours every day in front of the Blessed Sacrament. He celebrated Mass every morning. He heard confessions for 8 hours at a time. He built chapels and oratories and churches everywhere he went. He wrote books explaining the real presence. He created devotional societies centered on Eucharistic adoration. He lived what he preached, and when he died, his boys knew that if anyone had earned heaven, it was him. But Don Bosco never talked about earning heaven. He talked about accepting the gift of heaven. He talked about responding to God's love with love. He talked about cooperation with grace. He talked about the weapons God had given to fight the snares of the devil. And he warned over and over that those weapons only worked if you used them. You could not just own a rosary, you had to pray it. You could not just attend Mass, you had to receive Jesus with devotion. You could not just go to confession, you had to confess with sorrow and resolve to change. The boys who ignored those warnings ended up exactly where Don Bosco saw them in the vision, not because God wanted them there, but because they chose to be there. They chose pride over humility. They chose lust over purity. They chose theft over honesty. They chose disobedience over obedience. They chose human respect over divine approval. And those choices, made over and over without repentance, hardened their hearts until the love of God could no longer reach them. That is the danger of ignoring God. It is not that he stops loving you. It is that you stop being able to receive his love. You build walls, you close doors, you turn inward, and eventually those walls become a prison. Those closed doors become a tomb. That inward turn becomes hell. Don Bosco saw it. He warned about it. He fought against it his entire life. And the reason God showed him that vision was not to terrify people into obedience. It was to show them the truth that love without God is not love. The truth that freedom without grace is not freedom. The truth that choosing yourself over God is not independence. It is slavery. On the night Don Bosco burned his hand on the wall of hell, he learned something that no theology book could teach him. He learned that hell is not a punishment God inflicts. It is a choice humans make. It is the natural consequence of rejecting the only source of love, joy, peace, and life. It is what happens when a soul says, "I do not need God. I do not want God. I will be my own God." And God, in his mercy, honors that choice, because Love cannot be forced. Love must be free. And if a soul freely chooses to reject God, God will not drag that soul kicking and screaming into heaven. He will let it go. And where it goes is hell. The boys in that vision were there because they thought they could love without God. They thought they could be good without grace. They thought they could be happy without holiness. They thought the rules were just rules, the commandments were just suggestions, the sacraments were just rituals. They thought wrong, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The doors had closed. The choice was final. Eternity had begun. But for those of us still alive, it is not too late. We still have time. We still have grace. We still have the sacraments. We still have the Blessed Virgin Mary interceding for us. We still have Jesus waiting in the tabernacle. We still have the weapons Don Bosco saw lying on the ground next to the traps. All we have to do is pick them up. All we have to do is use them. All we have to do is choose love over self, grace over sin, God over everything else. That is the message of the vision. Not fear. Hope, not condemnation. Mercy, not despair. An invitation. God loves you. He wants you. He's calling you. He has given you everything you need to be saved. The only question is, will you respond? In the archives of the Salesian congregation in Turin, there is a letter Don Bosco wrote in 1872, 4 years after the vision. In it, he describes visiting the bedside of one of his former students, a young man who was dying. The man had left the oratory years earlier and had lived a wild life. He drank, he gambled, he cursed, he mocked religion, but on his deathbed he asked for Don Bosco. When the priest arrived, the young man grabbed his hand and wept. He said, "Father, I saw it. I saw what you warned us about. I saw the road and the traps and the door. I was running toward it. I could not stop. But then I remembered what you said about the weapons. I cried out to the Blessed Virgin, and she stopped me. She pulled me back. She brought me here so I could confess before I die." Don Bosco heard his confession. The young man received the last sacraments. He died peacefully 2 hours later, and Don Bosco wrote in his letter, "This is why God showed me the vision, not to condemn, but to save." In 1885, 3 years before his death, Don Bosco made his final trip to Rome to meet with Pope Leo XIII. The Pope asked him about his work and about his dreams. Don Bosco told him about the vision of hell. The Pope listened in silence. When Don Bosco finished, the Pope said, "You must continue to tell this story. The world needs to hear it. People have forgotten that hell is real. They have forgotten that choices have consequences. They have forgotten that love requires sacrifice. Tell them. Remind them. Save as many as you can." Don Bosco bowed and promised he would. And he did, until his last breath.